What's up, everyone? Welcome into DodgerHeads, presented by DodgerBlue.com, part of the Blue Wire Podcast Network. My name is Jeff Spiegel, and today we've got a special guest with us, Lance Brozdowski, who is the player development analyst for Marquee. Lance, we appreciate the time. You've been on before. Your stuff is always well received. So is the break, the off season, treating you all right?
It's going well. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's always fun. Some time to dig in. Accumulate half-baked thoughts is primarily what I'm doing right now, which is always fun because then I tell them to people and they either laugh at me or go, "We've actually thought about doing that." So yeah, it's been great.
And I know your focus during the regular season typically revolves around the Cubs. We're going to talk about at least one guy that the Dodgers acquired that the Cubs were sort of, I guess, on the periphery of being interested in. But I'm curious. I'll just start here as somebody who is not a Dodgers fan, which is most of the people that we have on. What's your perspective on just the insanity of what the Dodgers front office has done so far?
Jealousy, a lot of jealousy. Yeah, they've done. I mean, they've done a great job. I always say, like, people are always like, "Oh, would you sign this player for that money?" And I was like, "It's not my money." Like, yeah, of
Yeah.
course I would. You know what I mean? Just give me everyone. Give me everyone that has the potential to be this great. So, I mean, yeah, they're combining two of the highest profile Japanese players in the world, and I think they're just going to dominate. I mean, it's just so much off-field stuff, I think, that really goes into the equation around both those signings. Otani deferring all the money is wild. I mean, good for him. That dude is probably making more money than almost anybody in baseball in endorsements alone, so why not? But
Yeah.
yeah, Yamamoto was the one that I think the market had maybe the most wrong. I feel like, I don't know if it's just because I follow East Coast media, I'm from the East Coast, but I was pretty convinced he was going to be a Met or a Yankee. And then yesterday or the day before his press conference, he's like, I was always going to be a Dodger. And I was like, well, we didn't know that.
Yeah.
So it seemed like the industry had the Otani one pretty down pat, aside from the Blue Jays fiasco. But Yamamoto, I was convinced was going to New York, but you guys proved me wrong.
Yeah. Well, hey, the reason we've got you on is because the Dodgers, Otani aside, he will be a pitcher a year from now, but it's not today. You're sort of the guy that I go to, or I read, or I'm looking at information on. What do you think about players, and maybe why are players as successful or in some cases not as successful as you would like to think? And so the reason I wanted to bring you on was to talk specifically about Tyler Glasnow and Yoshinobu Yamamoto, the two pitchers the Dodgers have acquired. Of course, Glasnow via trade, Yamamoto via the biggest contract ever handed out to a starting pitcher. So let's talk about Glasnow. I'm curious, just from the jump, for somebody who does what you do and studies what you study from a pitching perspective, I have a hunch that a guy like Glasnow is probably one of your favorites. Is that fair, or am I maybe overstepping my bounds there?
No, he's fun. He's fun because he blends some of the modern elements of like having great stuff plus, which is that combination of velo release and movement that jumps. But he is also doing it in kind of like a traditional way. Like from a scouting standpoint, he extends down the mound so far. And I don't necessarily know whether that matters in the large range and sample of players, but once you get to the tails, like the guys who don't extend a lot at all, or him who's like 99th, 98th percentile extension, I think that does start to matter a bit. So he pops in a couple ways. I think everyone really likes him on a per inning basis. He's one of the best pitchers in baseball. It's just more a matter of the injury side of getting him on the field, but I'm confident the Dodgers can do that.
Yeah, you kind of hinted at it. The question I wanted to ask you is something that I've heard a lot around Glasnow is that he has top 5 stuff in Major League Baseball. And I think to the average fan who's maybe not digging into savant stuff or even, the stuff that's crazier than that, that I don't have access to, that folks like you might. I mean, Glasnow had a 3.5 ERA last year. And then you hear people talk about how, well, but his stuff is that great. So do you agree with this idea that he has top 5 stuff? And if you do, can you unpack a little bit what that means?
Yeah, totally. I'm gonna do something. So I actually hadn't looked at Glasnow a lot, and I knew I was coming to this pod, so I did a quick rip, like 30 minutes, just quick run through for some of the stat sources that I go through just to figure out what he was doing. Primarily, I was looking at what he was doing differently between 21 and 22, and I know I'm delaying the answer to your question here, but I think this will be valuable. So, anyways, interesting. 21 versus 23. So the main thing that jumped out to me was he's throwing his slider harder, about 3 miles per hour harder. Generally, when you throw something harder like that, you're behind the ball more, so it picks up a little more lift. I thought everything else on the biomechanics side, so like how he moved, we don't really have a lot of this publicly, but this would be like release point extension, release side, some of those basic factors all look pretty similar to me. So it seemed to me like he didn't have a massive adjustment coming back from the minimum amount of innings he threw in 22. That was the main pitch shape difference in my opinion. To lefties in particular is where most of the damage he gave up last year was. That's why I think the ERA is slightly inflated. If you look at him versus right-handed hitters, he's pretty much identical. He dominated them, even with that slider shape change. Versus lefties, throwing a lot more curveball at the expense of some four seam and some slider. The interesting flip I saw was that versus lefties, they started swinging more at his slider than his fastball. Those two flips, so it was like 55% swing rate on the fastball, 45 on the slider. Flip those such that it's 45 on the fastball, 55 on the slider. Not a massive change, but did jump out to me from a hitter tendency standpoint as to whether there was something about that slider being thrown harder and having more lift versus lefties that made them maybe see it slightly better. I also found it really interesting on the fastball in particular, especially when he was behind in the count. So this would be like a 2-0 count, a 1-0 count. He was throwing his slider a ton more. So you look at the slug difference on the slider versus lefties, and you go, it went up. And I think I'm trying to get better at understanding like the nuance of why things like that happen on a really high level. So the slider gets worse versus left-handed hitters. You just think it's a worse pitch immediately. But I don't know how much of that is just baked into the fact that he was throwing it so he was throwing it in 2021 when he was behind in the count. He only threw his slider 20% of the time. Last year when he was behind in the count to lefties, he threw his slider 42% of the time. That's a big jump. Yeah. So the fact that he's throwing that pitch more when he's behind in the count to a left-handed hitter, I think that creates more chance for damage. So that's perhaps why the slug was partially high. So that's kind of my synopsis. This is a very quick basis, like what I saw that jumped out. He was also pitching inside less, especially behind in the count to left-handed hitters with his four-seam fastball. I don't know why on that one. I don't know if that was some simplification. I don't know if that's a mechanical thing that was just taking him to his arm side more. But some subtle differences in his approach to left-handed hitters that I thought jumped out. Everything to righties looked pretty much similar to me. He dominated them. A little less four-seam, more slider. But I just didn't see anything that jumped out. So that left-handed hitter approach that I think something, if I'm a Dodger guy prior, whoever else is there looking through this stuff, I'm digging into that. I'm trying to figure out what we want to do differently there. And I think the Dodgers, if I had to guess as to why the Dodgers really like him, there's a variety of reasons. This goes back to your point about top five stuff, right? Extends in the mound really well, has good fastball shape, throws really hard. And then he also has something that's a little more modern that I think we're hearing about. We heard about it in the postseason. I know Jeff Passan did a hit on it, like the death ball, right? This kind of pitch that spins like a pinwheel on its way to the plate, coming from a relatively high release point. It's what Jordan Montgomery threw, more of a curveball for him. This pitch in particular, I think we're going to see a bit more of. We're going to see a bit more of a push towards this kind of dropping slider, especially from guys with high slots. I think we're going to get away from those guys throwing sweepers. I don't think the Dodgers have many guys that have higher slots that throw sweepers. So that suggests to me that maybe they have a little edge in this respect. Glasnow in 2021, that slider shape was more in this death ball variety, where I thought it was a really good pitch, and especially versus lefties, it's just fared better. When he went to this harder, kind of liftier version of the slider last year, it just didn't have the same success versus the left-handed hitters. So I'm very curious to see. I think there's maybe a non-zero chance they go back to the old slider. The hesitancy in me saying that is that it's harder. The new pitch is harder. And we've seen continually that the Dodgers tend to encourage guys to throw their sliders harder. We saw this with, I think, Emmett Sheehan. We saw this with Bobby Miller. Saw this with a couple other guys as well. Velocity is king. Velocity begets results. So that's my hesitancy in saying that. But I do know that perhaps the Dodgers and some other teams are really interested in that kind of really hard gyro shape going down. So if they can maybe figure out a way to go back to the 2021 pitch and throw it slightly harder, I think he could kind of unlock that left-handed hitter approach and get back to where he was in 2021. So top five stuff, absolutely. I just think there's a lot more nuance into like what they do with him. Yeah. But yeah, top 5, top 10, like he's nasty. He's a really good pitcher. It's just a matter, again, getting back to the point of like on a per inning basis, he's going to be great. It's just how many innings are we actually getting?
Yeah, it was interesting. We had Will Carroll, injury expert on Twitter. He came on the show a couple weeks ago and talked about health. And I was shocked because he basically said, I'm not worried about his elbow at all. The surgery they did, the results on that have been really, really good. And so, I was like, well, do you expect 150 innings a year from a guy like this? And he said, sure, why not? Basically. And I was like, well, if the Dodgers are getting 150 innings out of Glasnow, that contract's going to pay for itself pretty quickly for a guy like that.
Yeah. Totally agree.
I did want to ask, you mentioned extension. As I was looking through his stuff, 99th percentile extension. Obviously, he's 6'8", and he's pairing that with a fastball that is, one of the harder thrown fastballs in all of Major League Baseball as well. Sometimes I think we try and simplify it and say, well, it's a 97 mile an hour fastball. But can you explain a little bit, like when he's getting the extension this was a big deal in Dodgers world with Kenley Jansen because of how far he got out in front. So it'd be like, yeah, he's throwing 94, 95, but it feels like 97, 98 because of how much closer he is. Like, is that a fair representation of how to maybe interpret velocity and extension in tandem?
Yeah, I think we talk about like that's like perceived velocity stuff. And I feel like a lot of the sharper modern coaches I talk to all the time kind of always hesitate when I bring up extension. They're just like, I just don't, just again, don't really think it matters too much unless you're really, really on one of the tails of this and in a really distinct area that is above 7.5 feet or whatever he is, which is probably right around 7.5 feet. So the thing I'll say that I find extension has some impact on is adjusting release height and playing around with how that visually impacts the hitter. And I think we simplify it sometimes too much to the fact that it just shortens that time for the hitter to react. But I also think a lot of the time it plays with the approach of pitches into the zone. Think about this particularly with a guy. If you were to pretend you were pitching and stop when your lead leg hits wherever it's going to hit on a mound, and then slowly move that lead leg forward, creating your extension while holding your arm constant on your release, that's going to slowly drop as you're extending further down the mound, right? So I think that there's an element of extension in how it causes pitches to play that isn't fully captured in just you're shortening the window of time slightly because I'm extending this much further down the mound. So I think that's an element that maybe we don't talk about as much, but I think is really important. Generally, with that more extension, something else is probably happening in the body that's creating a different look of the pitch, whether it be a flatter approach into the zone, maybe a steeper approach into the zone if the guy stands up a little more on the mound and has a higher release height. But we are in this kind of model and mode in baseball of like lower release fastballs with ride. That's where you end up with like a Strider who extends really well, is relatively short, such that his ball gets so flat. If you had Strider's fastball and you were throwing from, a 6'2", 6'4" release height, like a more average release height with average extension, I don't think it'd be as good. So there's elements to the visual of a pitch that I think are influenced by extension that maybe we don't fully know from a numbers side because we don't really have that data, but I imagine teams are thinking about it as more than what we have on the public side of just perceived velocity.
Love it. Well, let's switch gears. Let's talk Yamamoto. This is a guy that I think as the average Major League Baseball fan is obviously way less familiar with. I get the sense that sort of baseball scouts, baseball nerds have been on this guy for the last few years. You hear that when Andrew Friedman, Brandon Gomes, those type of guys start talking. He comes over again. The Dodgers give him the biggest contract ever handed out to a starting pitcher. I'll ask you kind of an agree to disagree question here again, just to sort of wade us into the water here. Jeff Passan got on TV and said that Yamamoto is one of the top 10 pitchers in the world. He's 25 years old. He's never thrown a pitch at Major League Baseball. When you look at his stuff, and I know you've broken down some of this, when you look at his stuff, when you look at, the production is harder to quantify maybe and transfer over, but just from a pure velocity, movement, release height, etc., do you find yourself more in agreement or disagreement with a statement like this from Passan?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, it's all where we create that barrier of like, it was maybe he's top 12. Like, who are the 9 pitchers that have ahead of him? Like, I'm not entirely sure. So I probably agree with that. I'll lean agree. I think he's really, really good. I made a YouTube video that if anyone follows me, you're probably confused as to why I like him, because I went a little kind of lukewarm on that video, and I thought that was more of a thought exercise to bring up some ideas that just maybe were running counter to what I saw, and that actually came from people in organizations that weren't totally convinced he would translate immediately. And now that he's on the Dodgers, I feel like a complete idiot, because that was like the one team I was worried he would go to where I know that they're going to be able to extract as much marginal gain, marginal advantage over everything he's doing, more so than maybe other organizations if he had gone to perhaps the Mets or something like that, who I just don't think have the same pedigree on the Major League development side. I think they're doing a good job in improving, especially with Cohen and some of the minds they have there. Eric Yeagers is a former driveline guy who's doing awesome stuff. But regardless, besides the point, yeah, I guess I'd agree. And I think it comes down to one thing in particular. It comes down to, I think, the pitchability at the velocity. He's like a 95-plus guy with the four seam. I'm curious to see what the resulting shape is over here. I know Eno Saris did some cool stuff in looking at individual pitch types, which I think you just mentioned, and grading them out. I think I slightly disagree with it being a Gausman split. I think it's more like an Alex Cobb split in looking at how he's getting to the movement. There's multiple ways to like grip a splitter. Gausman is like a weird between guy where he's going like this. I don't have a ball on me, unfortunately, but like Yamamoto is wedging it. He's going like right in between the ball, which is very similar to what Alex Cobb does. I think even though the movement might be similar, it's getting to that movement in a different way. It also allows him to throw it slightly harder, I think, than a Gausman split. And I like it, but I think that fastball, like the key thing for me that jumps out is the ability to kind of place the fastball all over the zone. That pitchability mixed with the velocity is really interesting. It reminds me a bit of like a Garrett Cole, where he loves going like outer lane to righties with the four seam, that he loves elevating up for whiffs. Ideally, every guy could do that. The reality is a lot of them don't, because they don't have the command to put that fastball away, right? They have the natural misses on pitches are going to happen in the direction of the movement. So if you're a right-handed pitcher throwing to a right-handed hitter going out of black, like that ball's probably going to drift back over the plate and maybe up, and that's generally where you're going to allow damage. So it's a risky move. A lot of guys do not have the command to be able to do that. And if you believe the idea that as you throw harder, it becomes slightly harder to command the ball, you're moving faster, harder to control those finite finger movements that probably have some implication on command, then as you throw harder, it's less likely you're going to be like painting the black out of third for righties with fastballs. But it seems like Yamamoto has an innate ability to do that. I really like that from a pitchability standpoint. I think it essentially splits the fastball into like 2 pitches. It's not necessarily just a fastball up for whiffs. You could also throw it away. I'd be curious to see if he plays inside a little with it too, where that natural miss will take him off the plate as opposed to back into the zone. So that is a key thing for me, is like the pitchability at the velo, I think is really interesting. It's not something I mentioned in that YouTube video. I went with more lukewarm tape, but I'm already thinking of doing like another video where I'm like, what will the Dodgers tweak with Yamamoto? And I have some thoughts there, so we could probably get into that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear. I mean, as you look, give us the synopsis of maybe the things you're concerned about, and then pair that maybe with that piece of what might the Dodgers do to tweak that.
Yeah. So the thing that jumps out that I mentioned in that video that I still stand by is the fact that despite the fastball having good velo and pitchability, he didn't miss a ton of bats in NPB. This could be a byproduct of just guys throwing down in the zone a little more there and just not being in the correct spots to optimize on swing miss. But we saw this with Kodai Senga's fastball too. Different pitcher, relatively similar fastball shape. I know I get knocked for this sometimes for saying that, but he had below average swing miss in NPB on the pitch. He comes over here. He had well below average, or not well below average, but he had like 18% swing miss on it, where the average is like 22%. And he was also throwing it a lot. And you saw throughout the year that Senga backed off the four seam. So I think Yamamoto was using his around like 47 to 50% of the time in NPB, his fastball. I'm curious to see whether they back off that pitch slightly and lean on some more of the secondaries and kind of don't have him rely so much on that four seam and the pitchability. Just because you look at anything, like four seam is where you're giving up a lot of your damage. Yeah. You know, like at any sort you look at, like you generally want to lean on a slider, splitter, or something along those lines to improve quality of contact from a pitcher's standpoint. And swing and miss. So I'm curious to see exactly where they go with that. If they do that, you know, and they back off the four seam, I'd be curious to see the counter here would be like, okay, he's not getting a lot of swing and miss on the four seam, especially righties. So like, why don't we add some kind of sinker? Why don't we add something that if he's behind in the count, you know, I was talking about Glasnow, right, in terms of the differential and how he was using his slider, really jacked up his slider usage behind in the count. In Tampa, I'm curious to see whether behind in the count they go with more like sinkered with Yamamoto, which I think there's some room for in his repertoire. I'd be curious to see what the resulting shape is on it, but it kind of reminds me of, like, I don't want to say Ohtani, but in that area, right, where it's like the four seam on Ohtani isn't amazing. Yamamoto's is better, and I think Yamamoto has better command than Ohtani does. Ohtani's probably slightly better stuff, but I'd be curious to see sinker inside opens up the four seam away. We saw this with Gavin Stone. We saw this with Bryce Miller and a couple other guys going towards more sink. So that's the counter to like not having a ton of swing and miss on the four seam. Is like, well, maybe we had a sinker, push it inside, and then like you have three fastballs covering three, or I would say three fastballs, two four seam fastballs, right? The fastball up, fastball away to righties, then you have the sinker inside. Like that, I think could be really complex for a hitter. The other thing is the curveball. This grades out really well, but you just don't see a lot of curveballs below like 80 miles per hour being this great in the major leagues. So my guess is like he will have an above average curveball, but I think that they're going to encourage him to throw it harder and take away some of the movement and then see what happens. A lot of times what you happen with curveballs is like right out of hand, they pop. This is a stat known as like vertical release angle, which I think is available publicly somewhere. But that's essentially like the angle of the ball coming right out of hand. And all the time, like sliders are aligned more with fastballs, which I think is a very broad reason why sliders are thrown more in baseball. But curveballs pop all the time. So like that's why you get a lot of like, if you go fastball up and then curveball back into the zone takes, because like that hitter's thinking, okay, if my fastball line is up, that curveball comes above it. In my head, I'm going instinctually, it's above the fastball line, so it's a ball, and then the ball tumbles into the zone. So you get a lot of like breaking ball takes middle and up in the zone because guys just aren't used to that visual. But I just don't, I don't expect the curveball to be incredible at like 76 miles per hour or something like that. We just have so little precedent of that. So I would bet they try to push it up maybe to 80 miles per hour and take away some of the movement on it, and I bet it's a better pitch. Splitter's filthy. Like any splitter's great. I think we're eventually going to get a lot of teams throwing it more. We're already seeing kind of the Mariners do that with a couple guys, but that would be kind of the counter to what happens with the curveball. Those were the two main points that I brought up. Was like not a ton of swing and miss on the four seam, and I think the curveball isn't going to be as strong. The splitter maybe isn't as unique as like Kodai Senga, so I don't expect it to be as good as Kodai's. But again, we're working with more pitchability here. He's younger. He's going to the Dodgers. There's a chance they adjust things. You know, a lot of moving variables here that I didn't account for in that video. And personally, for that take I had in there, which is one of my most viewed videos of the last year, like I'm gonna get shredded because I have a feeling the Dodgers are gonna extract as much as possible out of him. And I wish I knew that he was going there before I said that.
Yeah, it's not even a terrible take, but as soon as he signs with a team like the Dodgers, you're like, gosh dang it. Like he's gonna get the 99th percentile. You might have played the percentages right, but he's gonna get the 99th percentile outcome now because he's headed to LA.
Exactly. Now you're spot on. I hate it, but I love it, I guess. I don't know. I'm excited to see what they do.
Let me ask you one last question. You mentioned this on Twitter, and maybe this is even nerdier than some of the stuff that we've talked about. One of the key things about Yamamoto people have pointed out is that he's gone away from a leg lift. You mentioned on Twitter that you are guessing that it's possible he gets into an organization like the Dodgers and that they go back to. What would be the reason for why they would maybe go back to a leg lift when, by all accounts, he's been incredibly successful as is?
Yeah, that's the main counter I've heard is like, well, he was better without the leg lift. But I actually sent that out before he went to the Dodgers. So I thought no matter where he went, and this wasn't talking to a couple pitching coaches, this is something I'm still trying to understand more. Biomechanics is definitely not my strong suit, but I'm trying to learn more. Linear versus rotational pitchers, right? A rotational pitcher, think of like a Aaron Nola or something like that. Just it creates more rotation in his body in terms of how he separates. Whereas a linear guy is like very direct to the plate, usually a little bit higher slot and how they move. And that I think has some implication on the leg lift. Guys who are super rotational for the most part are going to lean on that leg lift more and almost need that to kind of create momentum and help them throw hard. Whereas linear guys have a little bit more like what you call like a Tim Lincecum, like a little more like displacement of where their hips are and their shoulders are, so that they don't really need to be in line and rotating. A lot of them will kind of stay offset and be very like a javelin throw. Like that's the reason I think why, for the most part, Yamamoto likes throwing javelins, is that he's so linear to the plate, so direct to the plate that is how a javelin is thrown. Like you can't take Aaron Nola and have him throw a javelin. It would go left. It would not really go straight in terms of how he moves. So my theory here is just, I get that the leg lift may not be as important for guys so linear because he's not creating the same kind of momentum. He doesn't need time to gather momentum and go. But I do think it just allows him to get into his body more, and I still think the momentum matters to some extent. You see so few guys without leg lifts. I'm not entirely sure why he went to it. I'd actually be really curious to see if there's a Dodger writer that like eventually asks him and see what the take is. But I'm standing by my take. Like I just don't think he will be throwing like that when he eventually comes into the major leagues. I think they're just going to go back to a leg lift. It's just, you create more momentum. You use your lead leg block a little bit better when you're using a leg lift. There's more time to generate force. Like it just makes more sense. You sit in your back hip a little more, which again doesn't matter as much for like a linear thrower like him. But I just think you play around with it and see what happens. And I'm going to gamble there and say that he goes back to it. Maybe there's some variation, and maybe like he's slide step, he plays around with that motion that he was using last year from the stretch. I could totally see that. Yeah. But I would bet from the lineup he's a leg lift guy again.
Awesome. Well, Lance, I really appreciate the conversation. I appreciate the insight. Again, you take us to a level that I think the average fan doesn't necessarily always get, and you put it in a way that's understandable, which I appreciate the most. So thank you for that. Go ahead, plug. Let people know where they can find your written stuff and where they can find your YouTube stuff as well.
Yeah, I'm Lance BROZ pretty much anywhere. I do some short form content on TikTok and YouTube, long form content on YouTube as well. I have a Substack where I do kind of pitcher notes during the season. It's pretty dormant right now, but it will get going for next year. Yeah, Twitter, everywhere. I'm everywhere. So I'm trying to build the brand. Hopefully I'm doing well with that.
I love it. Well, we appreciate you. We appreciate your insight. You can check out his stuff again at Lance Bros pretty much everywhere. And of course, for us, make sure you subscribe here. You can check out DodgerBlue.com for all the latest as well. My name is Jeff Spiegel. That's Lance Brozdowski. Enjoy the rest of your day, folks. And as always, go Dodgers.